Hi students, this week we're talking about Asia in the Middle Ages, and I'm going to begin as I began last week by talking about India and Southeast Asia, and then we'll move over in the next video to China and Asia in the Far East. So when we ended the material on Indian history in the last class, we were talking about the Mauryan Empire. It's the first empire that's successful in uniting all of India. And this empire falls around 180 or so. When it falls, you have a variety of little kingdoms that are competing with one another. And then to the north, kind of in modern day Afghanistan and Pakistan, we find a new kingdom emerge called the Kushan Kingdom. And the Kushan Kingdom, at least for a time, is the most powerful political force in the region. And Kushan Kingdom is important because it maintains the Silk Road, trade between the West and the East. It maintains trade between the Roman Empire or the Byzantine Empire in the West and China in the Far East. The Kushan Kingdom also continues to promote the spread of Buddhism outside of India. And it's through their maintenance of the Silk Road that Buddhist missionaries are going to reach China. The next powerful political force to emerge in Indian history is the Gupta Empire. The Gupta Empire that emerges in India itself, like the Mauryan Empire, is once again successful in uniting all of India. Most impressive about the Gupta Empire is the wealth and construction of this empire. This is considered a golden age in pre-modern Indian history. When you had a very wealthy empire, and that this is reflected in the huge monumental temples that are being built in India at this time. Huge Buddhist and Hindu temples that are being built by the Mauryans. It's also, by the Guptas. It's also a really important part of the history, or the literary history of India. Many of the main, most prominent, most important works in Indian literature are developed during this point. And so the Gupta Empire lasts for several generations, but eventually falls to raiders from outside India in the late 5th century. Now we're talking about the late 5th century AD or CE. The late 5th century, of course, brings us to the 6th century, and then with the 7th century in the Middle East we have the rise of Islam. And so we know that Muhammad is influenced by Hinduism at least a little bit, and that he would have had some exposure to Hindu traders in Arabia. And as the Islamic Empire spreads across the Persian Empire, we find them coming into contact with Indian civilization. And Muslim armies are successful in defeating Indian forces in the Sindh region. That's the region furthest to the west in India. This region is conquered, comes under Islamic rule, and this is going to be the region of India that's going to be most influenced by Islam. It's going to be the region that's going to become Pakistan in the 20th century. Now we have a challenging situation in India where instead of Buddhism and Hinduism that had kind of got along together, or were at least somewhat compatible. Some people saw Buddhism as more of a philosophical system and Hinduism as a religious expression of that system, and so they felt that they could combine them together. At least we know that these two religious systems were able to coexist peacefully and were relatively consistent with one another. Hinduism and Islam are really diametrically opposed. Hinduism is based on a very structured hierarchy, ending with a priestly class, or the apex of it is a priestly class. But Islam, there is no priestly class. There's supposed to be direct interaction between the believer and God. Islam is strictly monotheist. Hinduism is split into many, many different gods. And so you're going to have periods of peace, but also periods when Muslim rulers in India are going to persecute Hindus, are going to destroy their temples, are going to kill those who they feel are carrying out blasphemous acts in worshipping all their different deities. There's a period of stasis in Indian history after the conquest of Sindh for about 3 centuries. And then we see new Muslim forces moving into India, but now from a different direction. Now it's from the north and west instead of from the west. And so from the north and west come the Turkic peoples, originally nomadic peoples who moved into Central Asia. In Central Asia, they converted to Islam, and now we find them moving into India. And so these Turkic peoples move into India, and they establish what's known as the Delhi Sultanate. The Delhi Sultanate, which controls most of northern India, succeeds in uniting and controlling most of northern India. We don't find a whole lot of evidence of efforts on the part of these Turkic peoples to move further south, and that's partly because they're worried about the Mongols. We're moving into the 13th century now. We find Mongol raids and campaigns across Central Asia. The Mongols don't come into India. And that's partly because these Turkic peoples were there, known as the Tughlaqs, who protected the Delhi Sultanate and prevented the Mongols from entering the Indian subcontinent. After the threat of the Mongols has faded, however, the Tughlaqs do expand and succeed in unifying most of the Indian subcontinent. And that, with some difficulties here and there, this unification, this system lasts until around 1400. And in 1400 we find one of the successors to the Mongol Empire, a ruler named Timur, who is a terrific military general, but a brutal conqueror. And he comes into India and he sacks the city of Delhi. And we're told 100,000 people died. There was blood slick on the streets. It was a terrible massacre. And it leaves us around 1400 with Indian civilization certainly not unified and certainly very vulnerable. I'm going to end talking about India there for this week. I'm just going to briefly talk about Southeast Asia, which is traditionally divided into two parts. The part that incorporates Vietnam, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, that part, and then the Indonesian archipelago to the south. In Southeast Asia during this period, we see the spread of Buddhism into these regions. That is, of course, an Indian influence. It's shaped by exposure to Indian traders and Indian Buddhist missionaries who are traveling into these regions. The main distinction to keep in mind between these two regions is that in the north, on the mainland continent, we find an emphasis on agriculture and rice production. And we see this kind of like combined influence of Indian religious ideas and Chinese political power, which we'll talk about a little bit in the next video. And then to the south in Indonesia, we find a great emphasis on trade. The production of spices in these islands is going to be immensely important and is going to bring traders through these islands from India, but also from China and eventually from Western Europe as well. So in Southeast Asia, we see this exposure to the outside world, to the world beyond India. And this is true of this Indian history as well. Outside forces, Islamic forces, Mongol forces, Timur, these are all powerful and sometimes challenging influences, or pose challenging questions to Indian civilization. But the overall theme here is that Indian civilization remains very traditional, but it is exposed to new ideas from outside India that are shaping it as well.